Welcome to MSL Talk with Tom Caravela, a podcast specifically designed for MSLs and all things field medical. Hey everyone, welcome to the podcast. My guest today is Cassie James. She's a medical science liaison at Ashfield. And we talk about how those with pharmacy backgrounds can transition into industry, specifically in a medical science liaison role. Cassie's awesome. I think you guys are going to really like this. Don't forget to follow us on YouTube and Instagram, and check us out on MSL Talk Live, which is the first Tuesday of every month at 1:30 p.m. Eastern time. And that's on Clubhouse. So download the Clubhouse app, check us out, and join the conversation. So, and hit me up on LinkedIn too. Hey, Cassie, welcome. Thanks for joining me. I'm so excited to talk to you today.
Thanks for having me.
So Cassie and I met. Let's go back, because I always like to give somewhat of the origin, especially like recently, because we're going to live conferences again. I get to meet so many awesome folks. And that's how I met Cassie. So we met in Vegas at the MSL Society meeting, which was a lot of fun. Cassie's awesome. Wait till you guys get to hear from her. She is a shining, up and coming shining star in this industry. So Cassie, thank you again for joining me. Why don't you do a quick intro?
Yes, thanks for having me. I've always been a big fan of your podcast and feel that it's super valuable for anyone aspiring to be an MSL or currently an MSL. So thanks again. I am a PharmD by training. I also have a master's in health administration, and I'm currently a medical science liaison. On a personal level, I'm also a mother of 5 and foster child advocate. So super excited to be here. Thank you.
Well, we're excited to have you. And this was, let me tell you guys, sometimes I like to say like how this stuff comes about. And basically we had a conversation, and I realized just in that conversation, Cass and I were talking, and there's so many pharmacists out there that are looking to transition into industry or looking to become MSLs. And Cassie, with her background, who's really done a great job in transition from pharmacy to industry, but also as a mentor, and she's really involved in the pharmacy community. Her story's a really good one. So I want to start with your story, and how did you transition, and how did you go from pharmacy to industry, and what can you share with folks just as a start?
Yeah, so I'm going to even rewind a little further. I'm a 20-year career waitress. So prior to obtaining my doctorate in pharmacy, I was a waitress, and waitressed all the way through 3rd year of pharmacy school. And some of those transferable skills are what helped me to succeed in my MSL role. But as most pharmacy students were really, pushed into the clinical or retail role, I started looking and, seeing what other options were available, and very quickly fell in love with industry, specifically the MSL role, how you can merge, science and communication. And so I went through the whole fellowship interview process, landed a fellowship, and completed the 1-year MSL marketing fellowship, and then immediately started my role as an MSL in my current position.
Awesome. So how do you like it so far?
I love it.
Yeah.
Dream job.
Well, you have the skills. I mean, you have the interpersonal skills. You're super smart. You got the scientific acumen. So I think that when looking at the skills and the qualifications that someone would need, I think you check all the boxes. So good luck to you. Now, and a lot of times clients come to us and they're specifically looking for PharmDs. Like, we get that. So what would you say, what's the reason for that? Why do PharmDs and folks with pharmacy backgrounds make good industry professionals, specifically MSLs?
So I think it goes back to the foundation of the PharmD training. We have exposure to all of the therapeutic areas and a foundational understanding of all the disease states. So while we may not have, therapeutic area experience in, say, for instance, cardiology, which was what my fellowship was in, we're quickly able to come up to speed because we already have a foundational understanding versus someone else who may have a more specialized training they would be the expert in that specific area.
Got you. Okay. So obviously foundation is critical, but then let's just say someone makes the decision that they want to transition into industry, or they want to try to take that career path. Like, where would you suggest they start, and how do they position themselves? It's not always easy. It's not like, oh, just do this. Like, what advice do you have for those folks?
Right. So I'll give two sets of advice. First, for the pharmacy students. So if you're a pharmacy student, going ahead from, as soon as you realize that you'd like to go into industry, holding leadership positions in school, building good relationships with your professors so that you can attain those letters of recommendations, trying to gain experiences with projects or organizations such as IPHO, really putting yourself out there and networking as you would if you were just hoping to obtain an MSL role. And then when we're specifically talking about someone who's a pharmacist, it's looking at the skills needed to be an MSL and finding opportunities to obtain those transferable skills. I mean, this could be through, a speaking engagement at your pharmacy school, or, a local community college, or it could be through, networking with another MSL and asking about working on a project, trying to understand maybe an MSL specific thing, like, what's the difference between an insight and observation? What value does an MSL bring to the company? So the more research you do, the more networking, the better you are to be positioned into that role later.
Yeah, that's great. So what about you mentioned, so like just going back and picking out one thing, like you mentioned, like the IPHO, and I know that I'm very familiar with the organization, and they're associated with their fellowship program and all the resources that they provide for pharmacists looking to transition into careers, especially in industry. Before we talk too much about the IPHO, did you do a fellowship?
Yeah, so I was involved in IPHO. When you're a fellow, you can hold leadership positions. You can be voted into leadership positions within IPHO. So I was on the National Fellows Council. So that is something I highly recommend. But I did do, 1 year postdoc fellowship, and on my own sought out leadership opportunities through IPHO. And they are like so many resources in that organization, coaching, career development, and then of course, educational webinars to kind of give you more information about different functional areas, or, how to prep your CV, interview recommendations, things like that.
Yeah. Well, I know it's hard to land those. So like, how were you able to get involved, and how did you land your fellowship?
So I didn't realize that I wanted to do a fellowship until later in my pharmacy career. So towards the end of my doctorate, but anything that you would do to prepare for even a residency, or to be a leader, or things that help you to stand out. So I completed a dual degree. So I recommend doing things like just looking and seeing how you can stand out from the other students. That could be the dual degree, holding a leadership role, working on special projects, networking, just really trying to make your application stand out, because there are so many pharmacy students applying to these fellowships. And then of course, resilience, not giving up, right? Following back up, because maybe the person that they originally selected for the fellowship went with a different company. And when they're looking to see like, well, who's next on the list, if you followed back up and did your homework and left good impressions, then they may consider you as the next candidate. So really trying to work on, being patient, resilience, holding leadership positions, and just not being afraid to hustle. if you do.
Well, I mean, that's the key. We talk about that all the time on this podcast. Like, you have to dictate how things are going to go. You have to wake up every day and figure out, what are the action items that I'm going to take today that's going to get me to my goal, whatever that goal might be, whether it's a fellowship, whether it's landing your first position in industry, whatever it might be. What are you going to do every day to take action to do that? Because you can't expect people to come to you. It's not going to happen, especially when it comes to the competitiveness of trying to get a fellowship or trying to land a position in industry. So I love the just that word resilient, I think says it all. And it makes a big difference. I want to get back to the IPHO just for a second. The reason I want to bring it up is I happen to know Jim Alexander. I actually talked to him the other day. He's the founder and CEO of the IPHO, and he shared some really interesting statistics with me, just for anybody that's interested in checking them out. He gave me the annual fellowship analysis of kind of the highlights of what the results of their fellowship program was for last year, but they had a record number of 738 fellows, which was 18% growth from the year prior. They had a record number of 431 first-year fellows, and 92 sponsor companies, which is another record. So, and the graduates were from 109 different pharmacy schools. And there was a record number of 94 Black pharmacist fellows, which is a 52% increase versus last year. So interesting stats. And I wanted to share that because it just shows you how fast this organization is growing and what they're able to do. They had 276 PharmDs from class of 2021 obtained direct to industry roles upon graduation. So that's pretty significant. And then 1/3 of those roles with pharma companies, 2/3 with service provider organizations like CROs and agencies. And then more than 140 different companies employed these PharmDs, with MedPace employing the most. So wanted to share those stats because Jim knew that you and I were going to get together and we were doing this podcast, and I asked him for some statistics. So wanted to share that with you guys. So think you should check out the IPHO if you haven't already. Let's get back to, you had mentioned, we were talking about how to position yourself. And I think what we need to talk about, which is always important, is like, what skills would you recommend people focusing on developing to really prepare them for a role as an MSL or preparing them for any role in industry?
Right. So some of the key, I think, most important skills are, emotional intelligence. I mean, there's a certain element to that cannot be taught, but everybody can improve. So, taking classes or researching about emotional intelligence, practicing communication. So that could be signing up for Toastmasters, different, whatever way that you can practice, showing that you're confident. Being a lifelong learner, right? You have to continuously stay up to date with, compliance regulations, as well as everything in your therapeutic area. So you need to be willing to take like personal initiative to stay up to date. What are new publications? What's, the pulse on the therapeutic area? And I think just back to the resilience, right? It's not easy to land a fellowship or an internship. Obviously, obtaining a professional degree is not easy either. So knowing that you don't just send in your application and then everything's going to work out. You really have to put the whole picture together with the networking, the transferable skills, the mentorship, the leadership, continuing to grow and look at where you have faults and how you can improve those.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. I think, and I know I'm going to be redundant by saying this, but if you want to get into an MSL role, you have to be all in. You got to dive in. You got to do everything. You have to literally jump into every aspect of the medical affairs community. You have to be active in that community. You have to cross every T, dot every I, and you really have to get yourself, you have to be visible. You have to get yourself out there. You have to make sure that you're putting yourself into the community, whether it's through networking, LinkedIn, applying for jobs, doing, trying to get the fellowship, or maybe it's a starter position. Maybe your path to the MSL role is through maybe a CRO. Maybe you take a position in industry on the vendor side, or the agency side. And that's the way you take a little bit of a side step to take a step forward. But I totally agree with you. I think that's awesome advice. So now let's go back to your story. So we have an understanding of where you come from. We learned that you transition, you have an MSL position. So how's it going? Like, what have you learned since you've been in MSL that you can share with other people that are trying to get there?
So I'd say that the value of an MSL role, it's so much bigger, the impact that you make on, your entire organization, the potential impact to patient care, the value you bring to the providers. Like, you hear about how valuable an MSL is, but it's hard to measure. People always talk about, logistic measurements of the value in MSL, but when you're in the role and you can see how maybe, like, initiatives within the company change based on your insights. When you speak to a physician and they're so appreciative because of the value that you've added on keeping them up to date on the latest science. And that trickles down to then, they may provide better patient care because they have, fair and balanced scientific data on their specific therapeutic area. So just really having firsthand experience about how important the role is, I think that can help, set a fire under someone to keep pushing through when they've heard, no 50 times, maybe the 51st time they would be given an opportunity.
Yeah. And it's you're right. I mean, the value of the MSL has never been where it is today. And what I mean by that is I think that the healthcare community has really become dependent on what the MSL offers to patient care and to their practice, and how important the MSLs are in really being able to be that conduit and make sure that the message that needs to get out to the healthcare community is actually getting out there, and it's getting out there in the right fashion. The other thing too is it's one of the most fastest, probably the fastest growing profession in industry. It's never been a better time to be an MSL. So it's an important role, it's a very valuable role, and it's a growing role. So I think if you're interested, it sounds like a commercial. Sounds like I'm trying to convince people. I don't have to. I know everybody that listens to this podcast doesn't have to be convinced, but I do want to actually reiterate that. So, and of course, I have to make sure that there's some form of disclaimer in here by saying that it's not all what it's cracked up to be. I'm sure there's challenges, right? So you get into the role. What challenges are you facing? What have you learned since you've become an MSL that maybe you didn't expect?
So, I started my MSL career during the era of the pandemic. So as you can imagine, everything in the healthcare system is kind of taken a hit, and people's time is restricted more than ever. The having to connect with somebody virtually, there's an added layer of disconnect there. So I think the greatest challenge is, gaining access to providers and making sure that you're being very intentional with the time that they do have, and then finding unique strategies to gain access when it appears that there is no access to that provider. So it's, both a positive and negative. I think that it's great because now we're forced into thinking of these creative strategies to connect virtually or gain access differently than what happened prior to COVID-19, but still nothing beats face-to-face. And so I think that that's kind of one of the challenges that I've seen.
Yeah. Well, and I think everybody's feeling that, especially, it's got to be especially difficult for someone that's kind of newer in the role, not seeing what it was like prior, just kind of coming into this, which is I hate to say the word new normal. I hate that expression, but this is all, I think a lot of any MSL that started in the last 2 years, this is really kind of all they know. How did you prepare for that? Was it part of your training? Was it just something that you had to figure out on your own? I'm just curious.
It was something that I figured out on my own, but back to those transferable skills and the value, through being a waitress and having to juggle, being a mother, a student, an employee, like I really learned to adapt. So having that adaptability and not just like settling. So, looking outside of the box and just being super creative, asking for advice from other people that I, have within my network, and just like picking people's brains. So really trying to just like build my knowledge base and then use my, creative strategies to think, okay, well, how else can we do this? This is how it was done before. And just kind of, doing an analysis. And pretty much I just saw what worked and continue doing that, kind of did self-evaluations of things that didn't work, and did less of that, and just kind of come up with my own strategy as I went along.
Yeah. You had to have had help though. Like as much, I don't know you that long, but from what I know about you, you seem like you're a really good people person, a really good networker. Did you find mentors? Was networking a big part of your strategy? I have to imagine it was.
I have to say, like, networking is the key. I know it's said over and over and over, and it has to be done in a certain way, right? You have to have done your research, speak your value when you reach out to a mentor. If you reach out to a mentor and you don't even know about the role, that could be taken as insulting or that you're not very serious. So, I did my research, and I found a mentor actually from this podcast. I heard someone on the podcast. I was very impressed by them. And I reached out on LinkedIn, with my request to ask them if I could hire them as a mentor. They end up doing it for free. And, just kind of continued that model of when I found somebody that I felt was a leader in industry, reaching out to them and just, letting them know my intention of why I wanted to have them as a mentor. And, just trying to see, well, can we set up a 5-minute call?
And it was basically pretty much that you found somebody in the MSL community through this podcast, reached out to him on LinkedIn, told him exactly what your intention was, and we're very specific and that whole thing. And then it just kind of came together.
Yes. And we met regularly, like weekly, for a very extended period of time. And then, eventually it went to like monthly, and now we just do check-ins here and there. But the mentorship definitely helped me to improve MSL role specific skills.
Yeah, that's awesome. I'll tell you, you really put it together. You did. And I appreciate I like your style, man. I just think that you put together a really good strategy and you got after it. And it's so important to navigate your own course. And I mean, I don't want to talk, we already talked about that, but I love your story. And I'm glad that we had a chance to tell it. What final advice would you give for people? There's got to be that one other, one more thing.
I guess my final advice would be just to, self-reflect and think about why you want to be an MSL. And then, use that as your driving force when you're having to go through this huge checkbox of, okay, I need to find a coach, I need to find a mentor. I have to redo my CV to industry specifics. I need to find, role specific skills that are transferable. The list goes on and on. But if you have done a self-evaluation and you really understand like why you want to be in this role, that's going to be the fire that keeps pushing you along, and, for you not to give up and continue and be resilient. And to be a good MSL, that's what you have to do. You have to continue to try and network and, see which strategies worked and which don't, and not give up.
Great advice. Cassie James, you're awesome. Thank you so much for coming on. This is a lot of fun. I wish you the best. I really do. And we're going to have to keep in touch, and we'll have to have you come back on one of these days.
Thank you so much.
All right. Bye, everybody. Thank you so much for listening to the show. If you've enjoyed it, please subscribe so that you don't miss episodes in the future, and feel free to leave a rating or a review or a comment. Thanks again, and I look forward to seeing you again soon.